all very, very much for your time. We are the Center for African, Latin American, and Caribbean Studies at JGU. We're very, very happy to inaugurate the semester and in grand style, co-hosting a webinar with the Center for African Studies at the Mumbai University, and with a stellar list of speakers and friends today with us. We have different time zones as well, which makes things even more special. And today we are talking about reimagining India, Africa in the global south. Africa, a powerhouse for natural resources, water, farmland, arable areas, 54 countries with voting power at the United Nations, growing macroeconomic stability, consumer markets increasing as well. On the Indian side, we have increasing public and private sector expanding their presence in several African markets through grants, through concessional loans, commercial loans, lines of credits, and investments as well. But in addition to finance, Indian capacity building in Africa, and Renu will talk a lot about African agriculture specifically, is also contributing to increasing productivity in agriculture, food security across all over the continent. I talked a little bit about Africa, India, just to set the scene. And now the third piece of this puzzle, today's puzzle, which is the global south, how these two regions of the world, they fit into the broader macro lenses of the global south, what ideas, innovations they bring to the table, being India and Africa themselves sharing perceptions about the global order and their role in it. Like the common but differentiated responsibilities, the call for developed countries to meet their climate finance commitments. And in the early 2000s, India and South Africa, along with Brazil, supported the break of patents for generic drugs production, established the India, Brazil, South Africa IPSA Forum. The three countries, they also stand together on issues like the reform of the United Nations Security Council, the BRICS countries, along with China and Russia. And I think we are at a very, very special point in time in which next year, India will be hosting the G20, South Africa will be hosting the BRICS. And in 2024, Brazil will be hosting both G20 and the BRICS. So opportunities for policy coordination, for economic cooperation, they're there, just ahead of us. And in addition to this, I think in the current geopolitical scenario, India, Brazil, South Africa, there are opportunities for these countries to exercise active non-alignment as well, and their place in the world. So given this overview, very rushed overview of what we are talking today, I'm very happy to have Renu Modi. She's professor at Mumbai University and co-editor of the book India-Africa Partnerships for Food Security and Capacity Building. Very, very happy to have also Mr. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, former ambassador to the African Union and several other countries as well. But last but not least, also author of a very, very interesting book, The Harambee Factor, India-Africa Economic and Development Partnership. Also very happy to have Sanusha Naidu, senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa, in Cape Town, now the most beautiful city in the world, as we were chatting before the event. And last but not least, my dear friend João Bosco Monte, president of the Brazil Africa Institute, currently in Fortaleza, Brazil, João. So welcome everyone. Thank you very, very much. Renu, would you like to say a few words as well?
I can start, that's it.
Wonderful. So let's do it. Let's. What I propose for this first round is that we take the next, let's say, 30 minutes to have the introductory remarks by each of our speakers, approximately 7-10 minutes each, to talk about trends and cooperation opportunities ahead of India, Africa, and the world from the different perspectives of the places and experiences you're coming from. And then for the following 30 minutes, we can have an open discussion on the issues that we that you bring during this first round of conversation, and then we can have a Q&A from the floor. So let me invite Renu to start.
Thank you, Karin. I thought that I could limit my presentation to the trends that are ongoing in the agriculture sector. I will draw from our latest book on India-Africa Partnership for Food Security and Capacity Building, to which Karin, Ambassador Gurjit, and several other technical papers have been contributed to. So what I'm presenting is actually a distilled version of what I have read from everybody's works. With regard to the trends in India-Africa collaboration in the agriculture sector, two things I would like to point out as a backdrop. That first is that developing agriculture is of critical importance, especially in the post-COVID scenario, given that agriculture employs a bulk of the population in Africa, and it's a continent where 23 out of the world's 28 countries are located, and a third of the population continues to be below the poverty line. And it's estimated over 300 million people in sub-Saharan Africa will continue to live in extreme poverty by 2030. The fourth point that I'd like to mention is that agricultural growth has a multiplier effect, and any impact on poverty reduction through agriculture is roughly 3 times more effective as growth in any other productive sector, such as industry and service. So, and in fact, global trends with regard to India-Africa collaboration in the agriculture sector. First of all, there's an increased complementarity of interest between South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation. So South-South cooperation has come a long way from the solidarity politics and the anti-South alliance that was formed at Bandung. And today it is based on multi-stakeholder approach, and it also acknowledges the role of the private sector and civil society for furthering global development objectives. Further, there are new avenues of funding development in the agriculture sector, such as sovereign wealth funds, and new donors are emerging from the emerging economies, and also such funds such as the IBSA Trust Fund, the New Development Bank, at a time where there is a declining aid flows from North-South cooperation in the post-global financial crisis, post-2008, and which has been accentuated further in the COVID scenario. The world faces common challenges of lack of availability of food and climate stress, and therefore there's been an increased realization that there cannot be any more operations of South-South cooperation alone, but a convergence of interests of the North and South-South cooperation. So there is greater multi-stakeholder participation in development cooperation. Second, with regard to the India, the second trend which we have noticed, that in the earlier years there was much talk about exporting India's green revolution to Africa. But over the years, the trend has shifted within India itself from the green revolution to the sustainable green method, given the limitations of the green revolution. That was a technological intervention that India had to adopt in the 1960s to feed its population and overcome famines, because it was also realized that this is a kind of a distorted model of production, because there's a heavy role of the state in subsidizing a host of services such as electricity, water, fertilizer, and it only benefits those with large farms. But the reality today is that most of the land is fragmented, and a large number of bulk of smallholders, farmers in India, as well as smallholder farmers. Besides, they do not have the costs for inputs such as fertilizers, seeds, and besides, because of the support of the minimum support prices, there has been a misalignment of cropping patterns. So therefore, and then the soil has been leached, and only crops which need excessive water, and irrigation facilities have benefited, leading to greater social inequity in the agriculture scenario. So therefore, India itself has adopted a green-led sustainability method where we are using micro-irrigation, where we are promoting millets, dryland agriculture, a use of climate smart techniques, and Africa has a benefit of hindsight because it's still in the developing stage. It can miss the stage of the green revolution and move on to the green-led sustainability method, which India is trying to share with countries in Africa. The third trend that we have noticed is the move from FDIs to contract farming and trading in agro-commodities. Now, according to Land Matrix, and we all know the global trends, post-2008, there was what was known as a land rush because of food insecurity in many countries, and also Africa, many LDCs in Africa offered an opportunity to produce crops and export to other countries, okay? And India also was one of the top 10 investors in land, given that Africa has good agroclimatic zones and abundance of land, tax breaks, etc. But what has happened is, over the years, it did not work out because land proved to be a highly emotive and a contentious issue. And there was issues of governance, change of regimes. There was a change in the lack of business environment, lack of infrastructure facilities. So if you have a farm in a far region of Ethiopia, there's no infrastructure of land, electricity, and the capital is too far. Even if you need a repair of a small an agricultural equipment like a tractor. Besides, then there came contentions which the investor was not aware of because the government gave the land in the name of vacant land, but allegedly these led to forced relocation of the local inhabitants who had usufructory rights to these lands for generations for cattle grazing. This led to litigations, and it was not a conducive business environment. With regime change came change in policies, which is definitely not the way a business can function. This had a domino effect, and other investors too were shy of investing in land. So what did they do? They moved from a more stakeholder consent-oriented form of investment in land, that is contract farming, and those who could not do that moved to trading in agro commodities, and contract farming with smallholder farmers, where they are partners, where the state also is and providing the governance mechanisms. And Mozambique offers one of the countries where there have been good partnerships, sometimes trilateral cooperation with US aid, which has been successful examples of contract farming, one of them. The second way the global community, including India, decided to deal with their food insecurity in select commodities such as pulses and oilseeds was through international trading in agro-commodities. Also, we must know that LDCs in Africa have a duty-free tariff preference scheme that was launched at the India-Africa Forum Summits, of which Gurjit was the Sherpa, one of the India-Africa Forum Summits. So agriculture contributes only 11% to Africa's total exports to India, and trading in agro-commodities has been pitched to about 5.3 billion in the same year. And the 33 LDCs in Africa are beneficiaries of India's duty-free tariff preference schemes. But there are only a limited commodities that, because of the lack of complementarity of interest between India and Africa. So the top 5 commodities of exports in agriculture were edible fruits, nuts, mainly cashew nuts, unshelled cashew nuts that is, and citrus fruits and melons. But the duty-free tariff preference scheme, the major beneficiary has been again, minerals, fuels, precious stones, and iron and steel. So agro-commodities actually take a very small percentage of India-Africa trade, about 10 to 11%. But that, suppose when India does not have pulses or mangoes, we did import them from Mozambique and Malawi. So that is a more agreeable form of cooperation that is ongoing between India and Africa. And besides, I feel if there are good trading relations, it builds trust. It lets you know your partners, which can form a backdrop for further investment in contract farming or with the stability in government into FDI. So I feel that this is a slow step-by-step process which is going to take ahead. But one of the challenges that we saw in the last 2-3 years was a knee-jerk reaction by India. When there was a surplus production of pulses in India, we rescinded the contracts or the promises we had made to Tanzania and other countries that we would buy their pulses. So this kind of a knee-jerk reaction did not go well with countries in the select countries in Africa, for example, Tanzania, and they quickly had to find other markets. So, but since India does not have a huge carryover stock in pulses, I'm sure it will have to go back to countries on the continent in Tanzania and make sure that these knee-jerk reactions do not happen in India-Africa trading relations and agro-commodities. Then the fifth trend that I find is the funding of agriculture. It's a complex landscape these days. So with the decline in the ODA assistance from the traditional donors, and the decrease in multilateral sources of funding, and the increasing gap in the requirement for funding, there have been major other avenues of funding, mainly from the private sector. And one more point I forgot to mention was that these ODA and multilateral funding have shifted their priority of investment from agriculture to other social sectors, such as health and education, especially after the global crisis of 2008. So now you have private funders, philanthropists, remittances from diasporas. So to complicate the dynamic funding landscape of agriculture, and which is so important and critical because SDGs 1 and 2 are critical to the development of agriculture, as I have mentioned earlier. Then the other sources of funding are the new emerging countries. For example, you will find Brazil, China, Turkey, Malaysia, Korea, Singapore, and a host of other countries. I mean, we only talk about India and China, but there are so many countries which have in their own capacity, the Middle East, which are investing in their own ways in countries which way they are aligned or have strategic interest. For example, many of the Muslim countries have money coming in from the Middle East or Malaysia and Turkey. So these are also complicating the landscape of funding. There's an enhanced role of the private sector, I feel, however, and blended finance. However, one realizes that though we talk of it as a wishful thinking that the LDCs in Africa would get this blended finance, but what is happening is that the LDCs get only 6% of this total blended finance into them because they lack the infrastructure or the governance facilities, and only top 5 countries which receive about 50% of the blended finance are Angola, Senegal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Zambia. So 3 of them are in Africa. And over 70% of the blended finance is extended to middle income countries, though we wish that it goes to Africa or the LDCs, but this is not happening. And now there's another insistence or trend in the request for effectiveness of aid and monitoring and evaluation, which has not been happening thus far because the money is so valuable and there is a resource crunch. And in this background, you have to pay for your results. So that is going to be increasingly be the trend. The money you spend has to be monitored, evaluated. And about 12 billion have been committed to lines of credits to Africa. And there was a funding gap between the commitment and the disbursement, which has kind of narrowed from 40% in 2015 to under 20% recently. So the government of India is working. And then there are newer funding mechanisms which have come, such as buyer's credit, which is on commercial terms, but it sidetracks and bypasses many of the requirements, intense bureaucratic requirements of the lines of credits. The last point that I would like to make, the trend would be is localization. And given in the post-pandemic scenario where we have seen the disruption of global supply chains and we are questioning the very existence of globalization when there is no food in Africa, in some countries in Africa, and excessive dependence on imports. Now look at the Ukraine crisis as well as the COVID. Countries like Somalia and Benin are 100% dependent on Ukraine's wheat. Countries like Egypt, Senegal, Angola are dependent on 80% of their requirements of wheat on Ukraine and others somewhere in between. So in this scenario, the mantra will be localization. The mantra will be increase in avenues for SMEs, for value addition in agriculture and smaller agricultural implements, not the large scale agriculture, agribusiness, but which will benefit small scale holders, the small scale landholders, and small budget mechanization. and sources of funding which are beyond the technical, which can sidestep the technical requirements of the lines of credits. So I think I have leave the rest to Ambassador Gurjit Singh to carry forward. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you very, very much, Renu. I think it was a very, very good overview of the where we are in the state of India and African countries' relations with a focus on agriculture, and all the challenges ahead in terms ranging from the low complementarity among some of these economies through the funding and what could be some of the ways forward in terms of, especially with the small and medium agricultural farmers. Moving to Gurjit, who I think will give another very, very good, I'm sure, and I'm sure he will also give a very, very good overview of where we are in the stage of relations, but also looking forward, where do you see Ambassador Singh these relations going?
Thank you, Karin, and thank you, Renu, for a wonderful presentation. And I look forward to hearing Sanusha and João, because it's always good to pat ourselves on the back of what we have done in Africa, but we really must hear from our other partners in the global south what they think about us. Karin, you rightly pointed out that the next few years are a good time for the global south to lead the world. So 2022, Indonesia chairs the G20. 2023, it's India. 2024, I think it's Brazil. And 2025 is South Africa. So, I mean, we are there in full force to save the world from becoming more bipolar and trying to keep it multipolar, if nothing else. And I think in that, Africa needs to play a role in many ways. We don't want Africa to become once again a playground of big power rivalry. And if we can work together, I'm sure we can prevent that. Now, one of the things which Renu has mentioned is about everything that we have done. So let me just say that I believe that the Indian model has succeeded in Africa. As Nehru said, substantially, though perhaps not in full measure. What we today need to do is reinvent that model, because post-pandemic and many things which have happened in the world, the old model cannot keep working, which was essentially based on some grants, which were government-led, and a large amount of soft loans. So we have to move to an FDI-led model, which essentially means you must bring the private sector to the fore. Now, I discussed this with the CII at the India-Africa Conclave, and we looked at starting a new India Development Initiative, which would have not only the government of India, but also bring in business, bring in academics, bring in think tanks, bring in civil society, and see where do we go. So we need to then engage on a wider basis and try and achieve the goals of the SDGs, climate, health, infrastructure, and try and differentiate what governments need to do and what can be done outside governments. And then perhaps we'll have a new model. But the FDI-led approach means that India must reorient lines of credit and its grants to address issues which will facilitate FDI. The advantage of Indian FDI in Africa and why it is respected is because it is mostly MSMEs. They transfer the most technology, create the most local jobs, and contribute the most to regional trade. Now, with the Africa Continental FTA coming in, the biggest advantage for FDI is the creation of regional markets in Africa. This means that you can actually have a larger market to which you can cater and therefore invest more. That is the model I am looking at. In one of the surveys that we did for my book, we found a large appetite among Indian entrepreneurs to invest more in Africa. And they prefer Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and Southern Africa in that order. Among African interlocutors, the survey that we did put the highest priority on human resource development and FDI. So on both sides, FDI is getting high marks for the new area where we must come together. Now, in this FDI approach, we must address some of the issues that the Indian entrepreneurs pointed out. For instance, large opportunities in Africa, but not enough demand, not enough project reports for bankable projects. So can we help in creating a bank of bankable projects? Can we have concessional lines of credit to reduce the cost at which lending is done in Africa by local banks? Because the costs of local finance are too high. For skill development, instead of setting up standalone skill development centers, India should work with its private sector that wherever they are investing, support them with skill development centers to create employable youth in Africa, who will then get absorbed by the new FDI, because they will be trained for what is required rather than do the same thing again and again. So these are some of the ideas we are looking at. And to build on what Renu said, one of the areas we look at is impact investment. Impact investment so far is running outside government and running very well. And we have got many projects coming up in Africa. They are small, but they are African ideas. We do it out of Nairobi, but recently we did events in Ghana, in Nigeria, and we are ready to go forward. Problem here is that African regional banks do not have the wherewithal. It's only South African banks which have the broad width to join this impact investment. Now I move to trilateral cooperation. Trilateral cooperation, where India is concerned, is largely a challenge to the BRI. And the Western donor countries are asking India to work with them because they also believe that our model works. And if they came along with us, they would get a cost-effective implementation, which is more acceptable. But within this, we are pursuing two models. One is with Japan, which is a B2B model, encourage more companies to work together. The other model is what we have done with the UK and now discussing with the EU and France, that they have, MEA has set up a trilateral development fund. So India and the foreign country can jointly contribute, and that fund will then be used for impact investment. The first such fund is managed by SBI CAPS. So it is partly something that the Harambe factor suggested coming true, but the proof of the pudding will be if investment decisions are left to professionals and not to government. Now, if you hear me on trilateral, you don't hear me talking about Brazil or South Africa. This is because IPSA has been a big disappointment. IPSA has kind of withered away. Now we have an IPSA fund, which we essentially use to go to countries where we are not represented. I remember Brazil led a project when I was ambassador to Timor-Leste. And I know South Africa led a project in Burundi. But this is a fill in the gap kind of a fund. It is not making impact. How much is IPSA ready to work together in Africa for Africa? Other way around, are Brazil and South Africa India's competitors or partners in Africa? I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very provocative, Ambassador Singh, and I was frantically taking notes and thinking of questions for our discussions as well. Let's hear what Sanusha's reactions and most importantly her introductory remarks. Will have a special time for the discussions. Sanusha, please.
Thank you very much, Karin. Good day to Ambassador, to Renu, to João, and to other colleagues online. Again, it's really great to be on this panel. I'm not sure how do I proceed after Ambassador and Renu, but again, congratulations, Ambassador, on the book. I am finding it fascinating as I'm reading. And I think what's really important as some of my introductory remarks is both Renu and the Ambassador bring different perspectives based on their experience working in the field of the context of the India-Africa engagement. And most importantly, I think Ambassador brings that professional experience of being a diplomat, understanding what are the current dynamics on the ground and how important that is in terms of where the relationship needs to move towards in terms of trajectory, both at a bilateral or at a continental level with 54, 55 states. And then, of course, more in terms of trilateralism and, of course, the multilateral dynamic. I think for me, what's very important is context. How do we contextualize India in Africa? And I think one of the things that you mentioned at the very beginning, Karin, was Africa and India. Because we talk about it in the context of how the narrative is prefaced. Do we talk about India, Africa, or Africa, India? And we have the same dilemma with all of our partners in Africa, not just with emerging actors or rising actors or revisionist actors, but all actors in terms of how the framing of the narrative takes place. And for me, that approach is very important because it gives you a sense of what the agency is in the relationship between the various. Of course, there's the question of the India-Africa relationship or the Africa-India relationship, which has to then be navigated at the regional level and, of course, also based on the continental relationship. And what I found very interesting for me in the context of what are the current trends in Africa is Africa is becoming a competitive, overcrowded space of actors, particularly in the context of the way in which there's been the reaction to China, the resurgence of traditional partners like your EU, and especially the US, utilizing the fact that there's so much of ventilation and discussion in Washington about Africa, about Africa's relationship with particular partners. Some are considered to be much more of a threat, i.e. China. Others are not considered in the same way. And so this critical juncture that Africa finds itself in the context of the relationship that it's crafting based on this momentum that Africa has reached a trajectory in its own development landscape through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, through the fact that there's a human resources dividend to be found with the youth, the untapped markets, is also playing into the unpredictability of the global arena. We're sitting in a very unpredictable international system that has created an interesting dynamic around whether we are entering deglobalization, whether we are entering a much more deeper deficit of democracy and governance, and more importantly, the unpredictability of sovereignty, state sovereignty, in the context of the role that you are supposed to play in the global architecture. And so Africa is in this space where it's trying to launch, or it has launched, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But in launching that African Free Trade Agreement, there's two dynamics that are, and two dynamics in terms of the narrative. Looking at the continent from the outside, looking in, and looking at the world from within, in other words, from within the continent out. And I think those two dynamics of the insider-outsider perspective on whether we talk about India, whether we talk about China, whether we talk about the actors of Turkey, which is quite, I mean, I think Turkey in this year alone has had many events centered around its Africa policy. The big question is really whether the trade dimension, the investment dimension, the resurgence of the kind of investment model that we are speaking about, is it really satisfying the interests at the border and the interests behind the border? And so you have to ask yourself, which Africa are we speaking to? Are we speaking to only elites? Are we speaking to only business to business? Are we speaking to the ordinary people on the ground? Because as the world turns, Africa becomes a microcosm of that world. It becomes a microcosm of the precariat, the global class of people that have been excluded. It becomes the microcosm of people who are reacting to leadership deficits and governance deficits. Hence, the pushback against exclusion from the transitional justice and the transformation agenda of socioeconomic inclusion and rights. It becomes the microcosm of the state, the subnational state, the subnational communities, and most importantly, the sub-regional communities. Are these regional economic communities that we are speaking about, do they have the ability to shape these kinds of economic dividends that's supposed to have borne out the kind of opportunities for people in the continent? And I think the trend for India, and of course, one of the things that we've got to mention here is that what kind of instability are we talking about? Are we talking only about interstate instability? Or are we talking about intrastate instability that is spilling over into regional cross-border tensions? The COVID-19 has essentially disrupted a lot of the economic and the political dynamics in both regional context as well as within states. But let's not be blind to the fact that Africa's instability has been there for the longest time ever. And so the trend, I think, or the relationship you want to craft with Africa from the India-Africa context is really around, yes, I think the dividend is on the human resource development capacity. That is India's important dynamic for Africa. It is different from the way in which you look at other actors look at Africa in terms of the resource extraction and so forth. And it takes it right down to the very nature of what does economic development mean in the African context. But just like India experiences and other actors experience, there's a rise of extreme violence. There's a rise of cross-border regional insurgency. There's a rise of challenges of human insecurity, both in the context of climate change, but also in terms of technological exclusion, disruptions. There's also the rise of fragile democracies. Do we actually realize to what extent these trajectories on the continent is going to inform what is going to be the kind of bilateral, trilateral engagements in Africa? It's not just about peace and stability and boots on the ground in terms of the UN blue helmets. It is much deeper about what kind of interventions need to be made, working with the African leadership, working with African civil society, working with the African Union, but also with sub-regional groupings that don't only exist within regional blocks. I think for me, it's going to be very important to look at democracy and the kind of questions around what ties us together and what brings us together in terms of the model that Ambassador put forward, which I think is innovative and very important, but also in terms of what happens if that starts to have other bigger implications in terms of going forward. So the opportunities are there. And I think there's two issues that need to be explored in the value proposition when we look at the continent. Do we only look at the continent's value proposition from an economic perspective? Do we only look at it in the context of what opportunities there exist in terms of the fact that the lens we use is a lens on private sector, on financing? One of the key issues that we have to be very careful of is that the value proposition of Africa is becoming a value proposition around particular levels of credibility and legitimacy. In other words, do we turn to Africa because this is where we get this credibility and legitimacy from? Do we turn to Africa because Africa has the scope and the expansion of the scope in terms of what it's trying to achieve with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? One of the challenges of the ACFTA is that whilst they have basically utilized the instruments around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's not going to be easy to deal with rules of origin. It's not going to be easy to see how countries are going to domesticate the rules of origin and the instruments of the ACFTA within their national legislation. We're also going to be challenged by the fact that regional economic blocs have non-tariff and tariff barriers against themselves. There's questions about how do you move goods and services? How do you actually realize that the movement of people is a critical dimension to the ACFTA? And more importantly, it's a critical dimension in terms of how do you deal with the kinds of issues in political economy at the border and behind the border. Let me give you a very important example. South Africa has a skills migration paper. There's whole challenges being raised about not just movement of people and goods across the South African border into neighboring countries, etc. But it's also the question that South Africa has to deal with the skills issue in terms of professionals coming in to work in companies. And that is becoming a serious disruptor to the kind of investment. Recently, the French Trade Councillor had raised for their managers to come in. These are big questions that will have to be dealt with. On the issue of Africa and the value proposition again, I think the challenge is agency in terms of, when we talk about, where do we see the relationship going? It's also the question of looking at where is the India-Africa summit? Where is it going to in terms of being a key vehicle? Is it still the vehicle that defines or contextualizes the relationship between India and the African continent? And then, of course, there's also the corresponding question of how Africa deals with these multitude of external arrangements and partnerships and relationships, and how it navigates that in terms of whether it's through the AU, whether it's through regional blocs, and so forth. I think the deepening question for me in terms of the promoting of the engagement going forward outside of the trade dynamic, because we have all come to the realization that I think we all agree that trade and investment are key drivers of the relationship in terms of where we are. But the narrative also tends to suggest that the type of trade you are doing is very important. I think India's trade with Africa, one of the things that Renu pointed out on the agricultural side was quite interesting. On the agricultural side, I think the agricultural trade is quite low. Manufacturing is quite low between including 2019 stats. Looking at the amount of investment that comes in, it's also asymmetrical. What you trading and what you're exporting and what you're importing. What you're exporting out of the continent and what you're importing into the continent, into that relationship. So two-way trade is important. There's the technical innovation questions, the acceleration of financial services and so forth. So for me, I think the challenge is not so much about what we know needs to be done. The question is, what is the agency in how it's going to get done? And there's a point I want to pick up on both Ambassador Singh as well as what Renu talked about, and that is understanding what's happening in Africa. It's very difficult to conceptualize in a homogeneous way the heterogeneity of the continent. It's not just about East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa. There's also the North African region as well. There's a number of different structural conditions that define challenges in terms of how do you deal with human security. And that's the big question in Africa right now, going forward, is all of the kinds of relationships Africa is crafting with different external actors comes back to the question around human security. And most importantly for me is the question of how do you sustain a stability around human security, not only in terms of conflict that is between different communities and between different regions, etc., and interstate conflict. It's also conflict that is around climate change, climate refugees, and climate instability. The more and more people become vulnerable in Africa, it's going to create a knock-on effect. And on the financing aspects of this, it's going to be important for us to think about what does the historical relationship between India, Africa, Africa, India represent in terms of the kinds of ways you want to move forward. There's a challenge of understanding Africa's moving in a very different, it's moving very fast, and there are new centers of powers in the continent, but there's also new centers of communities that are reacting to their governments and reacting to the way in which food insecurity, inflation, cost of living, the impact of climate change, the fact that food security must also be about food sovereignty in Africa. So I think these are dynamics that will definitely ask us about what we mean when we say we talk about a trilateral and a bilateral and a multilateral engagement. New sources of funding for the continent is critical, but Africa also sits on major resources that can fuel its own funding. The challenge is, what does it do to create the value chain and production at source? And I think these are areas that will definitely be important in terms of not just building up the national economic environment and the creation of opportunities for people within the continent in different skills, orientation, and human development resources and capabilities and capacities, but it's also about understanding how you integrate people and livelihoods into the value chain, into communities where you have to understand culture, you have to understand what ownership of land means, what ownership of engagement around models look like. And right now, I think when we talk to the continent, or we talk about the continent and we talk of the continent, we've got to realize that there are many lenses through which we need to understand the continent. There's not just one particular lens. There's the elite lens, there's the civil society lens, there's the sub-national lens, there's the sub-regional lens. There are communities that are existing outside of the state structures. There are communities that are reacting to skills deficit. There are communities that are reacting to the fact that there are leadership deficits. If elections are a minimalist approach to the stability of the continent, we have to understand that there's going to be national economic interests as well that also underpin the relationship with external powers. But it's also the national economic interests of actors, including India, to the continent. So I think for me, it's much more than just about what the business to business or what the civil society can do, etc. Because there are going to be threats that are going to emerge. There are going to be disruptions, and it's happening already in the extractive sector, and it's happening already in various parts of the manufacturing sector. And the localization, I think I cannot agree more on the idea that the language around localization has to include what it means to include people into the employment value chain, as opposed to just into the firm value chain of production. And that means there needs to be a skills level around there. Let me just end on the issues that I think are critical for us to think about in the context of where does Africa sit in the context of its own agency. I think there's a lot of issues that need to be harmonized around key turnkey projects for Africa. Africa needs to identify these projects. There needs to be that collaboration, cooperation. I think the trilateral approach is interesting, but it has to include not just the question of where does the investment go, but what is the investment need and what are the community needs? Because if you look at Mozambique and you look at what's going on in terms of the whole northern question around Cabo Delgado, etc., it's having spillover effects. And most importantly, I think when you're talking about these communities, etc., they have to be included in that discussion as well. The question is definitely around the fact that we are dealing with a serious transformation deficit in the continent of exclusion and socioeconomic rights. And now we're dealing with climate change. So what does the just transition mean in terms of funding and financing and new sources of funding for climate change? Because at the end of the day, we're still very much at the instrumental stage of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Yes, there are lots of discussions happening around it, lots of meetings happening around it, but we haven't really seen when it's going to start to take traction and root in the continent. So we'll have to be careful in overemphasizing the ACFTA, in my opinion, but it's definitely an important step going forward. And then, of course, I don't think Africa wants to be left behind in the technological innovation space, and that's an opportunity, I think, that India can definitely play a critical role in. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. And I could see not only myself taking vividly taking notes, including for the discussion, but also others. And I think the points you make, and especially on the agency and how we look into India-Africa, but also Africa-Indian relations are fundamental for our discussion going forward. I'm going to invite João to give his introductory remarks, and then we can move to a debate. João, please, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Karin, and thank you for the wonderful beginning that we have now. I took some notes here from Renu, from Gurjit, and from Sanusha, and I learned very much. Of course, I'm not in the expert. My role is more to give my ideas and my experiences between Brazil and Africa. Renu, you mentioned the Green Revolution, which is very important for Africa, and India can give a tremendous contribution to Africa, indeed. Ambassador, you mentioned one important thing about India and Brazil. We are partners or we are competitors. I think this is very important to put on the table. And Sanusha, you mentioned something very important, which is the continental relations. On the other hand, we have the country relation. And I come to this particular issue, Karin. I've been traveling within Africa for maybe 12 or 13 years. And I visit many countries more than once, more than 3 times, more than 10 times. And some countries I visit not so often. But I see a very close a possibility of relations between Brazil and some specific countries. When you talk about India-Africa relations or Brazil-Africa relations or US-Africa relations, we put the whole continent in one single basket, which is not easy, because how can we compare Nigeria with Namibia or Cape Verde or South Africa or DRC? If we consider that the countries has individualities, singularities, I think it would be more easy for us to establish a country relation rather than a continental relations. I understand we need to speak with the continent, and I know, Ambassador, you've been at the African Union and having the conversation within the continent, in a continent perspective. Sometimes it's not easy, because if you start to discuss with the different perspectives in terms of economic, in terms of government, it's not easy. But what I'd like to emphasize now, Karin, is my perception about Brazil and Africa, or Brazil and some African countries, which is more easy for me, and I think this can enrich our conversation, bringing my experience. When I founded the Brazil-Africa Institute 12 years ago, the idea was to establish or to reconnect the relationship that Brazil have with some African countries, which is not easy, because Brazil is very big and Africa it's bigger than anything. But I understood at the very beginning that we should use our assets, our links that we have already in front of us. If we see our capacity to engage, I think it's more easy. And I'm coming to the first question you sent to us, Karin, about the trends. My feeling is that in some areas, Brazil and also India can play a very important role in the cooperation, in the dynamism of engagement within Africa. And I could start with the area of infrastructure, which is very needed in Africa and still. And India and Brazil can help very much and engage with the African continent. And agriculture, of course, agriculture is a very important need for the African continent. Let me give an example. Ghana itself imports per year 1.2 billion tons of rice. This is something that the country cannot afford anymore. And recently, Nigeria, the government of Nigeria imposed a ban for importation of rice. So Nigeria needs to import rice. They need to produce rice rather than import. Who in the world can get benefits out of this? India, yes. Brazil, yes. And then I think this is a trend that we can have very easy in front of us. Also, Sanusha, you mentioned many times about trade, and trade is very important. The AFCTA is a reality. Sometimes we do not understand in front of us how this could be, but I understand the free trade continental area is an important tool for many countries, for India, for Brazil as well. I remember in 2018, I started to discuss about this, and the conversation became to a position that some Brazilians start to consider investing within Africa. In 2 weeks, Africa will have an important meeting in Barbados. The Afrexim Bank, the Import-Export Bank of Africa, will hold a meeting in Barbados. So why they are coming to Barbados? Because there are some open discussion, and the government of Barbados it's keen to start a conversation within Central America countries. The other thing I'd like to mention is the investment. I think it was Ambassador that mentioned, and you as well, Renu, about investment. Without investment, it's not possible for us to do things. And then the private sector, it's very important to come to the conversation. And I suggest you, Karin, for the next event that we organized, for you to invite some faces from the private sector to give the ideas about how they do feel in investing and contributing to do things within Africa. We can bring the private sector. We should bring the private sector to a very pragmatic way in order for them to contribute. And the private sector plays an important role when the government has a policy for investment. And without having a government policy towards investment, it's not easy to attract the attention of the private sector. And what is the aim of investor? Is to be profitable, to make money, to have the business flowing, to have the business growing. So if we give the credentials, if you give the aspect, you mentioned, Sanusha, about democracy and stability. Yes, we have to give to the private sector the right perspective that they will be, they will succeed if they do business within Africa. And also we have the climate change agenda, which is very important, and everybody's talking about climate change. I remember that COP26 in Glasgow mentioned the role of Africa, what Africa should do, and now we are coming to Sharm el-Sheikh in November for the COP27, and Africa will play an important role as well. So climate change should be in the agenda. And we should see how we can contribute, how Brazil, how India can contribute with the experiences that the country can put on the table as well. And the other trends that I think that should be emphasized is how can we engage the diaspora? How many Africans are working, living, doing things, doing business in India? How many Africans are in Brazil? So sometimes we do not see, it's kind of invisible space, but I understand we should engage, we should bring to have an empathy with the diaspora in our countries. Sometimes we do not speak with them. When we talk about Africa, we should fly from India to Africa, we should fly from Brazil to Africa, but what about the Africa that we have within our countries? How many Africans do you have right now in India? If I do make this question to the three of you, you don't know, you may don't know. I don't know how many Africans we have in Brazil, and we should know who they are and how we can work with them. And I will stop now to come to the conversation, the question, Karin. But I'd like to emphasize that you mentioned two important moments, 2023 and 2024. I understand the IPSA and the BRICS should be re-emphasized, by the government, and we need to have a face. We need to have someone from the government that leads the conversation. And right now, look into the BRICS and look into IPSA. We don't have a government policy towards the engagement of the both BRICS and IPSA. And I understand 2023 could be the moment that the two, IPSA and BRICS, can come back to the arena and to bring the importance of the conversation among ourselves. I stop now, Karin, because I think it will be good for us to discuss among ourselves how we can share our inputs. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm breathless, honestly, with the wealth of ideas and experiences that you all brought to the discussion. And I was thinking just some of the questions based on the initial questions that I proposed, and mainly the opportunities going forward and how to part of it. And if I may, I'm just going to introduce it to the two questions, but please feel free to react to them and other issues that you've heard that you think might be useful, and even ask questions amongst yourselves based on your conversation. So this is really just to kick off our conversation. So I think we talked a lot from different angles to the concept that Sanusha touched upon, which is the value proposition. But value proposition not only for India on Africa, but also Africa on India. And within each one of these countries, how this value proposition is built within the different segments of the society, right? Not only the elites or the governments, but bringing the different insights. You also mentioned about being a value proposition, mainly not only economic, or a value proposition that it's foreign countries in Africa trying to look for legitimacy or credibility, or even from within Africa, internal issues related, how to manage the specific questions around the FTA, or which avenues to engage with India blocks that could serve these different purposes beyond trade issues, right? And you also mentioned the challenge that it's is not what needs to be done, but how to do it. But I would like to bring perhaps a third dimension to it. Is it's not only how others see opportunities or the value proposition in Africa, how Africa sees a value proposition in working with others, but what value proposition we can eventually build together amongst these different countries. And Ambassador Singh made a very powerful statement at the very beginning. 2025 South Africa has the G20 presidency as well, and he said, in quotation marks, "the full force, we are at a moment of full force to get the road out of bipolarity." So building on this, a very powerful message that I think Ambassador Singh brings, what could be our value proposition? And now I'm not only talking about an Indian value proposition for Africa or an African value proposition for India, but us as Global South, as members of the Global South, obviously not representing the whole Global South, but is there a value proposition that we could bring forward to the table? And if so, what could it be? Yeah, so I'll ask this first question, and then I can engage.
If you don't mind, I would like to speak, but I need to go.
Oh, so please.
All right. So
You're the first, Ambassador Singh.
This has been a most fascinating discussion to hear three continents talk about Africa. So our model of cooperation with Africa was three-tiered. There was the Pan-African tier through the African Union. There was the regional tier through the regional economic community. And there was the bilateral tier, which is the normal diplomatic. My book shows that despite all good intentions of India, the first two tiers, to put it mildly, flopped. African Union did not have the political will or the wherewithal to even assimilate what India was offering. They are run on emergencies. They are not run on value systems. The regional economic communities, including those that function well, the EAC, the SADC, ECOWAS, could not absorb a single institution that India offered. Therefore, by the time of the third India-Africa summit, India went whole hog back to a bilateral approach. That is where we are. Now, the new approach, the India Development Initiative that I mentioned and the FDI-led approach is going to make this worse, because we are now not seeking to saturate Africa with our influence. When you let the private sector out, they are looking for people, profit and sustainability, hopefully, which means they will go to those countries which offer you the best opportunity. Now there is no egalitarianism that I must go to every country in Africa. They will go, and my survey shows which countries they chose or they preferred to go to. So you are going to have a shakeout. Now, whatever the state of the Africa Continental FTA, every country needs to get its act together if it wants foreign investment, Indian or other. That is the base point. And I frankly don't see why India should now be choosing to saturate Africa. I think we've done it over 15 years. We've reaped good rewards, and let's leave it there. Now comes, what can IPSA do together? I mean, frankly, IPSA should do something together. Now, the IPSA fund should not be a government-led fund. There should be a private sector-led fund for IPSA, which should invest in Africa, bringing in the best of Brazil, South Africa and India. And this should bring together the businessmen and the funding organizations and say, okay, we are going to do lighthouse projects. And again, we will look at the best places where the investment can happen. We should look at health, we should look at SDGs, we should look at climate, we should look at infrastructure, because all three IPSA countries have different stakes and different strengths. So I think that is the direction we need to go. I don't think any of us needs to reinvent the old wheel. We need to move from a car to an EV and decide on a new method. But interestingly, neither of the two from Brazil or South Africa clearly answered me. Are they competing with India or are they willing to partner with India? I am assuming they're willing to partner India. That is why I'm making this suggestion. Thank you. I'm here for another 5 minutes, but then you must let me go. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll drop the second question very briefly, as perhaps you can add to it, and others can answer both together. So Ambassador Singh, how to ignite this enabling role of the governments and find models for engagement that go beyond governments?
So today the focus is very largely on ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance. If you want new funds, you are getting a lot of ESG funds. But don't forget, there is a G in the ESG. That means good governance. So the ESG funding will naturally go to those countries where you can have good governance. And if the numbers in Africa for those countries is small, because the Mo Ibrahim index is not looking good for now, then I'm afraid the investment will only go to those few countries. And there is no need to go beyond that. We should encourage African countries and all countries in the global south for that matter to follow good governance methods on our own. We don't have to listen to others, but there are. But more importantly, the how. I have been a votary of a track 1.5 dialogue, which should be between India and the African Union, which should bring in academics, think tanks, businessmen, civil society, and talk what is our future. This is what Sanusha and João also mentioned. But I am giving you a suggestion how we should do it. We can also do it at the IPSA level. Now, we all tend to wait for governments to set this up. Why can't 3 think tanks or 3 universities just set this up and have a chat? What should we be doing together? And give that report to the chambers of commerce, to the governments, to everybody, and say these are our suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Renu.
My God, I'm still processing all that Gurjit had to say. Yeah, can you repeat your question briefly again, Karin? Can you repeat your 2 questions again, please?
How to
Maybe
create
I can-
value, how to create
maybe I
a
can give-
value proposition, and how to ignite the enabling role of governments to promote them and to find models beyond the public sector, beyond governments as well, to take this value proposition forward.
Well, I feel that, this it has to come from from within countries in Africa, because African countries have an agency today. Africa is like a marketplace. Every country is not what they were at the decolonization phase of the 60s. Every country in the global south was lost finding its feet. But today, Africa, it can work or does work very smart, playing one stakeholder against the other. I feel that, Africa is at a point where it can choose what it wants to do. It's no longer the Africa it was of underdevelopment or lack of choice, lack of partners, lack of funding. Now, the value proposition for Africa, again, depends on good governance. Like, you cannot, I feel that, there has to be an amplified role of the state. Even if the private sector has to be active, it is the government-led. There has to be a very strong government. The rollback of the state, the neoliberal policies that were like the LPG liberalization, privatization, globalization clearly has not worked in Africa. So there has to be more advocacy from think tanks, from a more strong state, which sets the rules for the private sector. However good the private sector, well-meaning, smart, sustainability-led it is, but private sector is capital-led. It's profit, as time and again we see. So where do you draw a boundary between what Gurjit is saying and what Sanusha is saying? Where do you bring in communities and private sector? And for that, you definitely need to be vigilant. You need to have monitoring and evaluation, which has not been a part of our lines of credit. Governments see red the moment you talk about M&E. They see it as a stepping on the sovereignty of African states or other partner states. I don't know if African states see that, but in every discourse that we have discussed in India on the lines of credit and funding, they say no. In the global south, it's based on trust. It's demand driven, and we only give the LOCs. Monitoring and evaluation is not our job. It is of the recipient country. Yeah, but these notions, I feel, have to change, because through academic discourse, through discussions, because how do you take more value for money unless you show more results? As Gurjit rightly said, funding, water finds its own level. Very simple childhood experiment that we did. So unless there is good governance, and look at regimes like Ethiopia, massive FDIs were made by companies in Ethiopia. But with the regime change, there are, investors tend to lose money because policies are changed. Unless Africa offers stability to countries, like, Rwanda is a case that, so far so good. It has not had a regime change, but the crucial point or the crux of it will be when, God forbid, if it happens soon or whenever. So when there is a regime change in a government country like Rwanda, what is it going to be? Because so far it is the donor darling. I recently visited Rwanda. It's really, forget many aspects of it of good governance, but it does have good governance in many ways. There is no crime, there is stability, there is, freedom of movement around for people. The investors are happy because there is stability. Yeah, I met so many shopkeepers who have lived in Kigali for, I think, 20 years or more, and nobody has a complaint with regard to, they say these are the set rules, you have to follow the rules, and that's fine by them. They make profit, they contribute to the economy. But in most countries, then corruption in Africa, and as in other parts of the global south. So unless the recipient countries have to play a larger role in determining how the value proposition can be added to their products.
Thank you, Renu. Sanusha?
Thanks, Karin. I mean, I'm not sure if this is something that needs to be ventilated further, but the point is that doing business is a two-way street. Both the recipient and the host economy, or the economy that's receiving the investment, and the investing country or business, both have to apply to the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's very critical on the ACFTA, which is going to become critical for all private sector in the continent, is whether you abide by the ACFTA rules on standard norms, investor compliance, accountability, monitoring and evaluation, not only on the context of your investment, but also in the context of how you may be impacting on accelerating climate stress, how you may be actually impacting on environmental sustainability questions. And the good governance question is not just the good governance question of whether you have a stable government. The good governance question is also the question of whether you are contributing to the sustainability and not contributing to the environmental stress of society. And I think the challenge in terms of the value proposition is, yes, Africa is changing, and yes, Africa does have important priorities that it needs to take in terms of demonstrate that change, and how that illustrating how that change represents an investment compact that essentially looks at the way Africa's agency is translated into those mechanisms that bring and attract that investment. But one of the things I think we've missed in the conversation is whether the model is sustainable, the investment-led model. Because very often, I think that we look at what particular sections and constituencies want in terms of the model. And there's a reaction to the model. If any one of my colleagues and have read the book, The Precariat, the global class that's rebelling against the kind of economic model that is now entering into a state of implosion, I think we'll realize that when the farmers in India, when the municipal workers in South Africa, when the manufacturing sector and public service in Nigeria, when the oil and gas workers and exclusion of communities in Cabo Delgado start to push back, the question then is, what is the stability about? It's not only the fact that the governments have not necessarily translated an inclusive society in what they produced and promised and whatever in the context of democracy and elections, but it's also the fact that if you look at the Niger Delta, we've left a vacuum with dislocated, disorganized, and a complete pollution disaster, where companies have not been held accountable. And with investor dispute mechanisms that need to be held in Africa and not outside of Africa, it's Africa's responsibility. And I completely agree with that. But if you're going to look at investment in that kind of linear vertical integration approach, communities are going to keep pushing back. And I think it's a responsibility of everyone, not just African countries as well. So I think for me, the challenge is really in the architecture of what the model is, because we do realize that whilst trade investment are important, there's a reason why we're having this implosion. My one big example is Sri Lanka. The other example is Zimbabwe. The other example is what's going to happen after the elections in Angola. The other example is Kenya. Nobody wants the 2007 and 2008 violence to emerge, because political maneuverings in that electoral process is essentially being contested in terms of where political elites don't agree with the outcome of something, and then it ends up into that. But it does hurt companies. The behind the scenes kind of negotiations that happen, we have to be very clear. I remember in my first project on South African corporates, and I'll try and get to Ambassador's point about whether IPSA is a competitor or a partner in the context of South Africa, is one of the first things that I was told by a banking institution looking at South African corporate footprint in Africa is, remember, the business of business is business. That's the bottom line. And that always sticks in my head in terms of what is your economic, your environmental, sustainable, and governance accountability as well. So we can talk about governments, we can talk about civil society, and civil society does shine the light in dark spaces and ask the awkward questions, and they also experience the backlash. But it's also the question around the fact that there are countries that today are stable, but tomorrow will become very unstable because the underlying issues that actually are festering and tensions that are basically being bubbling under in terms of how societies become stable is also being challenged in terms of what we talk about. So I think for me, the challenge is really around what is going to be the compact of the investment, impact assessments, the monitoring, the evaluation, the environmental and the sustainable governance and good governance, because these are norms, values, and propositions that we've looked at in the context of whether we look at how sanctions work against countries, sanctions work against companies. It has disrupted value chains, but at the end of the day, we're seeing a much more precarious class of people and a more vulnerable set of people who are now just saying, well, we are excluded and we can't deal with this imploding model.
Absolutely agree with Sanusha. Yeah. And that's what I was saying, then you need to have more regulatory mechanisms on the private sector to unleash its potential, use its potential, yet at the same time, I mean, no private sector is going to be voluntarily doing its CSR or ESG. There are voluntary guidelines, but for that, there has to be some accountability.
Yeah, let me again come back to the issue that I raised before. I understand we have to see how stability, democracy, the scenario within Africa. I understand that, but I understand also the other side of the table should be active, should propose things, and I see that the government policy from the country that wants to deal with Africa should be provocative. And I remember President of Turkey, he started to travel to Africa after COVID, in a very pragmatic way. And now, just for us to have an idea, Turkish Airlines flies to Africa, to 53 destinies within Africa from Turkey. What does this mean? Means that the country is very focused doing things within Africa. Of course, when you see examples of democracy, you mentioned Rwanda. I've been to Kigali many times, and I see many companies doing business within Africa. When President Kagame said that Rwanda should be recognized not only because of the genocide, not only because of the jungle, not only because of the forest, but because of a space of stability, of the space of technology can be emphasized within East Africa. Yes, companies from companies from outside Africa will come to Rwanda, but I understand the government of Brazil, the government of India, the government of Turkey should be in a very pragmatic way focused in doing business within Africa. And I say not Africa in general, but to some specific countries. I remember when the former president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, said at the very beginning of his government that Africa should be and would be a priority for his government. And he put in place a very important government policy, bringing people from the government to see African perspectives, but also he invited many private sector actors to come to Africa to see what potential of Africa could bring to the Brazilian business agenda. And this brought the idea that yes, we could do things together. We need to see the country, the Africa country, how the picture is, how the democratic is the government, is the country, how secured is the country, how the environment it's appropriate for companies to do business, but also we should emphasize that someone needs to start, because we may go to the chicken and egg story, right? So he's going to start first. If you continue saying that Africa should be less corrupted, if Africa should be more democratic, yeah, everything that we are saying now, it's important, it's relevant, but in terms of business, we should be very, let's say, pragmatic. The government of the US sent Anthony Blinken to visit some African countries to restart the conversation with the Prosper Africa. The AGOA agreement will end in 2025, so 2 years from now, three years from now, and they are now thinking to bring African US products to be deployed, to be put on the shelves of African countries. So what I'm trying to say is someone needs to start the conversation, and I see that we have to, maybe us, we should give evidences to Africa, to Brazil, to India, that we should go to Africa and say, let's have a fair game with some specific countries. Yes, some countries within Africa, I understand they need to fix things, but that's their business. If they do not fix things, we should go somewhere else. And if we go somewhere else, we may be able to do things in a very proper and affirmative way.
Excellent. I see Sanusha has her hand up. You want to add something, Sanusha?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit on the idea of how trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, trade agreements, and even these continental agreements that follows on the back of these visits that have been made to Africa. If you look at the AGOA, which is going to, quite rightly, as João said, it's going to expire in 2025. But the challenge with this AGOA is that it's not going to be as liberal and as accommodating as previously. Because a lot of what's going on with the AGOA negotiations right now is about how the US wants to actually deal with domestic markets at a bilateral level. In other words, private security interests of their companies, looking at the whole kind of chip act that was passed in early August, which opens up the market and excludes certain other actors, how that may shift the continental landscape in terms of the fact that if we are talking about Africa, and I talk about the entire continent, not just sub-Saharan Africa, as an independent continent that can make its own decisions pragmatically, then we shouldn't be having the discussion about who we can do business with. We should be able to do business with everybody. But some of these acts are placing particular restrictions on the way in which we are engaging, or the way in which African countries are being pursued or looked at in terms of engaging with different external partners. And I think to a large extent, what we are entering now is into a very interesting mercantilist approach in the context of the global economy, whether we call it deglobalization, whether we call it the fact that value chains are just being disrupted, whether we call it anything. But the problem is that economic nationalism has become part and parcel of the agreements as well. And in terms of the relationship that Africa has with external partners, it's also caught in a bit of the crosswinds and the headwinds, because on the one hand, there is a competitive, intra-African competitiveness taking place. Who attracts the funds? Who attracts the investment? Who attracts the business? Some countries may have better structural conditions to be able to provide that kind of return of investment. Other countries do not. And to a large extent, you're seeing this kind of geostrategic politics playing into the continent's engagement in terms of how it sets out as part of the challenges, looking at Kenneth Waltz's structural realism and the kinds of debates that happen around that. If you just follow the debates that are happening in various, in foreign affairs, in The Economist, etc., there's very interesting narratives about what Africa should be worried about, what Africa should be scared about, who are the actors Africa should be cautious about. And I think these are becoming quite interesting between the lines of Anthony Blinken's visit. What was interesting was that whilst you had not necessarily direct references to questions about how does Africa engage with China, the indirect references to it is what you need to pick up from the narrative. The extrapolations of that are very, very important in terms of what our foreign minister, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor, said in the press briefing with Anthony Blinken about we will choose our own foreign policy path. We will choose who we'll engage with. And what's interesting as well is the placing of some of this legislation in countries like the US, which then has an impact on whether you can do business. So I think we've got to be careful as well in terms of, oh, if you don't have the right conditions in your country, we'll take our business somewhere. There's also an implicit influence, a geostrategic, geopolitical influence on the continent based on these agreements.
Right. Thank you so much, all of you, and Ambassador Singh as well. We're short of time. Unfortunately, I think I could stay for another 2 hours listening to you and asking questions and debating more. Before we wrap up, I know that all of you need to leave. If you could answer in 2 simple lines, if possible, of course, because we discussed so many issues. What are the opportunities ahead and how we take them forward? How we do it? If we can, from what we've heard, what we've discussed, what is the main takeaway? João.
If we see the 2 biggest events that we had recently, COVID and the war, I think we should see the perspectives, right? How we are so necessary, how it's so necessary for us to work together. We should see how we can put our hands together, look into the needs that each country, in the case of India, in the case of Brazil, in the case of some African countries, how we can work together to promote not only the trade, not only the business, but the cooperation. And we should be more strong after some very difficult moment, COVID and the war. The war is not over yet, but I understand we should see how our weakness can be connected in order to facilitate the approach. And the agenda of South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, I think now it's more and more emphasized. And 2023, I understand, I'm thinking very much about this in our agenda at the Brazil-Africa Institute. And now this year we have the 10th edition. Africans, Indians, people from many parts of the world to discuss how 2023 will be a tremendous year for our initiative. So I am very optimistic, Karin, Sanusha, and Renu, for the possibilities that we have next year. And I wish you that our conversation now can be a positive moment, Karin, for us, for ourselves, but also for other people to engage with us in order to be together, to bring positive results for everybody. So that's my remarks.
Sanusha.